This is Formosus. Formosus lives in Rome. Well, I say lives. Formosus lived in Rome until the spring of 896, when he died at roughly 80 years of age, of what the sources describe, with suspicious brevity, as a stroke. Nobody at the time was accused of anything. I mention this because of how rarely I shall be able to say it again. He was buried in St. Peter's with full honours, which by 9th century standards is about as well as things could possibly end for anyone. And in January of 897, Formosus is going to stand trial. Yes, I'm aware that sentence requires some elaboration. This will not be a trial about his estate, or a tidy legal formality conducted around an empty chair. The defendant will be present, 9 months dead, exhumed on the orders of the new Pope, dressed in the full papal vestments, and propped upright on a throne in the basilica of St. John Lateran to answer in person for his crimes. Someone, incidentally, had to dress him. Do spare a thought for that man. History does not record his name, which one suspects was the only kindness he received that week. The Church would later call it the Synodus Horrenda, the horrible synod. Historians, who rename things constantly, have never once felt the need to improve on that. Now, to understand how a corpse comes to be cross-examined, you need to know what the papacy was in the 890s, which is to say, a prize. Italy was contested between two factions. On one side, the House of Spoleto, led by the Empress Agiltrude, who was the sort of woman contemporaries described very carefully. On the other, the supporters of Arnulf of Carinthia, a Frankish king with an army and, briefly, momentum. Formosus, while alive, had crowned candidates from both sides, which struck him as diplomacy and struck the Spoletans as perjury. By 897, the Spoletans were back in charge of Rome, and the new Pope, Stephen VI, owed them everything. What the family wanted was revenge on Formosus. What they got, because Formosus had inconsiderately died, was a compromise. The trial would simply proceed without waiting for the defendant to be alive. The corpse was seated on a throne. The charges were read out: perjury, coveting the papacy, and violating the ancient canon which forbade a bishop from transferring from one see to another. Formosus had moved, decades earlier, from the bishopric of Porto to Rome. A teenage deacon was appointed to stand beside the corpse and conduct the defense, answering questions on his client's behalf. In fairness to the boy, his client raised no objections. The defense strategy, insofar as it can be reconstructed, appears to have been silence. It held. Stephen, by all accounts, screamed at the body. Why did you usurp the see of Rome? That sort of thing. At length, to a corpse. The corpse maintained what the record suggests was a dignified silence. No transcript of the exchange survives, which is arguably the greatest single loss in the history of court reporting. At some point during these proceedings, or near enough to them that all of Rome noticed, an earthquake shook the city and brought down part of the basilica itself, from the altar to the doors. Stephen's supporters regarded this as unfortunate timing. Everyone else regarded it as a review. The verdict, which will astonish nobody, was guilty on all counts. And here the consequences begin to cascade, because a guilty pope is not merely a criminal, he is an invalid pope. Every act of his papacy was declared null. Every ordination he had performed was voided. Every priest he had made was, overnight, not a priest. Through no fault, it should be stressed, of their own. Until that morning, choosing the wrong man to ordain you had not been a recognized career risk. And this created, and I want to be measured here, a certain administrative difficulty, given that one of the bishops Formosus had personally consecrated was Stephen VI. It's worth pausing on who this actually was. Formosus had spent 50 years in the Church's service. He had been its great missionary to Bulgaria, reportedly so effective that the Bulgarians asked for him by name as their archbishop. He was, by the mixed standards of a bad century, one of its abler and more austere men, and he ended as a prop, wheeled into a basilica, so that a frightened successor could shout at what remained of him on behalf of a family he had crossed. Then it was made formal. The 3 fingers of his right hand, the blessing fingers, were cut off. The vestments were stripped. The corpse was redressed in a layman's clothes and buried in a common grave for foreigners. Then it was dug up again and thrown into the Tiber. The word again is, at this point in the episode, doing considerable work. Yes, that's what they did. It gets worse, although for once not for Formosus. A monk retrieved the body from the river, quietly the way one does, and then Rome began to talk. The corpse, it was said, had started performing miracles, which, whatever one's position on the theology, was considerably more than it had managed at the trial. Public opinion swung hard against Stephen. Within months, Rome rose. Stephen VI was deposed, stripped of his own vestments, imprisoned, and, in the summer of 897, strangled in his cell, by whom the record declines to say. 1100 years on, the official position remains a shrug. There followed what historians politely call an unstable period. 9 popes in 8 years, a turnover rate normally reserved for perishables. Boniface VI had managed 15 days. Theodore II reigned for 20 and spent virtually all of them on Formosus. The body was recovered, rehabilitated, revested and reburied in St. Peter's, allegedly to the approval of the images of the saints, which were said to have bowed as it passed. John IX then convened a synod which annulled the annulments and banned, explicitly and forever, the placing of dead persons on trial, a law whose necessity tells you everything you need to know about the century that required it. However, in 904 came Sergius III, a Spoleto man who had in his youth taken part in the original Cadaver Synod and who remembered it, apparently, the way other men remember a good wedding. He reaffirmed the conviction. There is a persistent later tradition that the body was exhumed once more. The historical record is uncertain. One rather hopes it stayed where it was. Which brings us inevitably to the question of why anyone puts a corpse on trial in the first place. Because it was never about the corpse. Annulling Formosus's papacy annulled his appointments, his alliances and his coronations. It redealt every hand in Italy in the Spoletan's favor at the cost of one exhumation and a morning shouting. The synod wasn't madness. It was paperwork, conducted by other means, upon the only participant who could be relied upon not to argue back. The dead make excellent defendants. They never contradict you, they never produce witnesses, and they never ever appeal. Every faction in Rome understood this perfectly. That is the genuinely dreadful part. Not that it was insane, but that it was sensible. We do still do this, incidentally. Every failing company, every incoming government, every regime of any size holds its own small synod, in which everything wrong is discovered to be the fault of the person who has just left, who is, conveniently, not in the room and cannot answer. We have refined the format considerably. We no longer require the body, just the name, an audience, and somebody new in the chair with a very great deal to explain. Formosus, for what it's worth, got what very few men in history have ever managed. He was buried in St. Peter's with full honors twice